"You have to choose, me or that stupid baby," said the millionaire's fiancé about the newborn son of his late sister. The man instantly knew what he had to do. Mike Reynolds thrived on structure. Every morning began with a perfectly brewed espresso, a brisk workout, and a glance at the day's itinerary, color-coded and optimized for efficiency. His empire, built from the ground up, was a testament to his discipline. A millionaire by 35, Mike had a reputation for precision and control, qualities that made him a leader in the cutthroat world of corporate real estate. But beneath his polished exterior, Mike was lonely. His fiancée, Cleo, preferred gala events to quiet evenings, and their conversations revolved more around their social image than personal dreams. The only genuine joy in his life had been his younger sister, Lucy, though their bond had frayed over the years. Lucy was everything Mike was not: impulsive, creative, and fiercely independent. She had once dreamed of being an artist, filling their childhood home with sketches and splashes of paint. While Mike built his empire, Lucy carved her own path, often refusing his offers of help. Their conversations became sporadic, Lucy's pride keeping her struggles hidden from him. Mike often thought about her during his moments of quiet reflection, remembering how she would pluck daisies from their mother's garden as a child. "For luck," she'd said, weaving them into chains. He hadn't seen a daisy in years. That Tuesday evening, Mike was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed. The voice on the other end, calm but grave, delivered the unthinkable: Lucy had died in childbirth. He barely registered the details, the complications, the emergency surgery. His focus narrowed on a single fact: Lucy was gone, and she had left behind a newborn, still unnamed and clinging to life in the NICU. Mike's chest tightened as a flood of memories hit him: Lucy chasing fireflies in the backyard, her laughter echoing through the halls of their childhood home. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Daisy." The nurse on the line paused. "I'm sorry?" "The baby's name," Mike said, his voice cracking. "Her name is Daisy." That night, his meticulously ordered world fell apart, replaced by a single, chaotic resolve: he would protect Lucy's child. Mike stood outside the NICU, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. Inside, rows of tiny, fragile lives lay surrounded by machines. One of them was Daisy, her breaths shallow but steady. The nurse on duty, Claire Bennett, approached him with a clipboard. "She's stable, but the first few weeks will be critical," Claire said, her tone professional yet kind. "Do you want to see her?" Mike nodded, his legs heavy as he followed Claire into the room. Daisy was impossibly small, her tiny fingers twitching occasionally. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, each beep reminding Mike of how precarious her situation was. "She's beautiful," Claire said softly, glancing at him. Mike's throat tightened. He barely knew how to hold a conversation about babies, let alone care for one. Yet, as he looked down at Daisy, her small features seemed to echo Lucy's, the resemblance striking and undeniable. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice rough. "The hospital will care for her in the short term, but after that, she'll need a legal guardian." "That's usually next of kin," Claire explained. Mike's chest tightened at the thought. He was a businessman, not a parent. But the idea of leaving Daisy in the hands of strangers felt like abandoning Lucy all over again. "I'll take responsibility," he said firmly, surprising even himself. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal paperwork and emotional chaos. Mike's fiancée, Cleo, was less than supportive when he brought up the decision. "Mike, this is insane," she said, pacing their penthouse. "We're not equipped to handle a baby. Especially someone else's." "She's not someone else's. She's Lucy's," Mike shot back. "And what about us? Our plans? You're going to throw everything away for a child you didn't even know existed a week ago?" Cleo's voice sharpened, but Mike had already made up his mind. Back at the hospital, Mike found Claire in the NICU. "I need your help," he admitted. "I don't know the first thing about raising a child. Would you consider working for me as Daisy's nanny?" Claire hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she considered his offer. this isn't a decision to take lightly, Mr. Reynolds. I'm not, he said, his voice steady. Daisy deserves a chance. And I can't do it alone. After a long pause, Claire nodded. For Daisy, I'll do it. With Daisy cradled in her arms, Claire watched as Mike signed the final paperwork. His resolve solidified, his life was no longer his own, it belonged to the fragile little girl who had already changed everything. The car ride home was eerily silent, broken only by Daisy's soft breaths from her carrier. Mike glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Claire beside her, carefully adjusting the blanket around the newborn. His chest swelled with a mix of uncertainty and determination. At the penthouse, Cleo stood waiting, her arms crossed and her expression frosty. The chic, minimalist apartment, designed to reflect Mike's polished lifestyle, felt stifling now. Daisy's carrier looked out of place against the sleek furniture. Cleo's smile was thin. So, this is her? She asked, peering at the baby with disinterest. Yes, this is Daisy, Mike said, his tone firm. She doesn't even look like you, Cleo muttered, stepping back as if the infant carried a contagion. Mike, I agreed to give this a chance, but it's too much. You're jeopardizing everything we've built together. Claire, sensing the tension, picked up Daisy and excused herself to the guest room Mike had hastily arranged. Once they were gone, Cleo's veneer of patience cracked. I'm serious, Mike, she hissed. This isn't what we planned. We were supposed to be traveling, investing, building our lives. Not raising a baby that isn't even ours. Mike took a deep breath, keeping his tone measured. Lucy was my sister. I owe this to her. And Daisy, she's family now. What about me? Where do I fit into this? Cleo's voice rose, but Mike didn't flinch. You're supposed to be my partner, he said quietly. But if that's too much to ask. Cleo didn't let him finish. Too much? You've brought chaos into our lives. Don't expect me to stick around and play house. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in years, the apartment felt cavernous. Mike slumped onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. The life he had meticulously built was crumbling, yet as he heard Daisy's faint cry from the guest room, he knew he couldn't turn back. Later that night, Mike found Claire sitting by Daisy's crib, softly humming to calm the baby. She's had a rough start, Claire said without looking up. She's not the only one, Mike replied, managing a faint smile. Claire glanced at him, her eyes full of empathy. We'll figure it out. Together. For the first time in days, Mike felt a flicker of hope. Despite the fractures, there was a chance to rebuild, this time, with Daisy at the center of it all. Mike's life was unrecognizable. His meticulously planned days were now dictated by Daisy's needs, midnight feedings, doctor appointments, and sleepless nights. Claire's support was invaluable, and slowly, Mike found himself adapting to the chaos. Yet, beneath the surface, tension with Cleo simmered, threatening to boil over. One evening, as Mike returned home, he found Cleo sitting in the dimly lit living room, her expression icy. We need to talk, she said, her voice clipped. Mike set his briefcase down, already bracing himself. What is it now, Cleo? It's her, Cleo spat, pointing toward Daisy's nursery. That baby is ruining everything. We were supposed to get married, travel the world, and live the life we planned. Now, everything revolves around her. Mike's patience wore thin. She's my niece, Cleo. My family. I didn't choose this, but I'm not turning my back on her. Cleo stood, her anger rising. And what about me, Mike? Am I supposed to just accept that my fiancé is throwing our future away for a child that isn't even his? You don't have to accept anything, Mike said, his tone sharp. But I've made my decision. Daisy comes first. The words ignited Cleo's fury. Then you need to choose, me or that stupid baby. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Mike stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. Are you even hearing yourself? He asked, his voice low but cold. You're asking me to abandon an innocent child. Lucy's child. I'm asking you to prioritize us. Do you even love me anymore, or is this just about your guilt? Mike's expression hardened. If you really loved me, you wouldn't make me choose. But since you did, the answer is clear. Cleo blinked, stunned. You're choosing her over me? Yes, Mike said simply. Without another word, Cleo grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The echo reverberated through the penthouse, leaving Mike standing in its wake. He turned toward Daisy's nursery, where Claire was rocking the baby to sleep. For the first time, he felt a sense of clarity, even as the weight of the decision settled on his shoulders. Everything okay? Claire asked softly, sensing the tension. It will be, Mike replied, his voice resolute. It has to be. The weeks after Cleo's departure were tumultuous, but for the first time, Mike felt like he was moving forward. With Cleo gone, the penthouse transformed into a home, baby laughter replaced tense arguments, and Claire's warmth brought a sense of stability Mike hadn't realized he needed. Daisy was thriving, her health improving daily, and Mike was finally starting to believe he could handle fatherhood. He even began taking mornings off to feed Daisy, his once rigid schedule adapting to her needs. But peace was short-lived. One afternoon, as Mike returned from a meeting, the doorman stopped him. Mr. Reynolds, there's a man asking to see you. He said it's urgent. Mike frowned. Who is he? The doorman hesitated. He said his name is Anthony. Claims he's here about the baby. Mike's heart sank. The last thing he expected, or wanted, was Daisy's biological father showing up. Upstairs, Mike found Claire in the living room, her face pale. She didn't need to explain, the tension in the room spoke volumes. Standing by the window was a man in his mid-30s with a rough demeanor and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Mike Reynolds, the man drawled. We finally meet. I'm Anthony, Daisy's father. Mike's jaw tightened. I wasn't aware you existed. Anthony shrugged. Lucy and I had our ups and downs. She didn't tell you about me? Figures. But I'm here now, and I want what's mine. Mike stepped forward, his tone icy. Lucy's gone, and you abandoned her. Daisy isn't yours to claim. Anthony's smirk faded. Careful, Reynolds. I've got rights. And if you want me to walk away, it's gonna cost you. Claire gasped softly, her hand instinctively reaching for Daisy, who was napping nearby. Mike's protective instincts flared. Get out, Mike said, his voice steel. If you want to pursue this legally, go ahead. But don't think for a second you can intimidate me. Anthony chuckled darkly. You'll regret this. He walked out, slamming the door behind him. As the tension in the room lingered, Claire sat down, trembling. Are you okay? Mike asked, his concern shifting to her. Claire hesitated before answering, her voice shaking. I've met him before. Anthony, he's dangerous. Mike's stomach twisted. What do you mean? She looked up, her eyes brimming with emotion. He's the man who, she stopped, unable to finish. Mike's fists clenched. Whatever Anthony had done in the past, one thing was clear, he wouldn't let him anywhere near Daisy, or Claire. The encounter with Anthony left Mike rattled, but it was Claire's revelation that turned his unease into full-blown determination. Over a quiet dinner that evening, Claire shared her story. Anthony and I crossed paths years ago, she said, her hands gripping her teacup tightly. I was young, naive, and he took advantage of that. He was manipulative, controlling, and when I tried to leave, he became violent. Mike's jaw clenched as she spoke, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Did you report him? Claire shook her head, her eyes downcast. I was too scared. And he was good at covering his tracks. By the time I worked up the courage to leave, he'd already moved on to his next victim. Mike leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. He won't get near you or Daisy. I'll make sure of it. The next day, Mike contacted his lawyer, Samuel Greer, a sharp and unrelenting advocate. After hearing the situation, Samuel was blunt. If Anthony's making threats and claiming paternity, we need to act fast. We'll need evidence to challenge any claim he makes and, ideally, proof of wrongdoing on his part. Mike nodded. Whatever it takes. I want him out of our lives for good. Claire, despite her apprehension, was resolute. She agreed to help gather statements from others who had suffered at Anthony's hands. Through her connections, she reached out to 2 women who had experienced similar abuse. Slowly, a disturbing pattern emerged. Anthony had a history of exploiting women, leaving them emotionally and financially drained. Meanwhile, Mike worked to strengthen his own case for custody. He ordered a DNA test to confirm Anthony's claim of paternity, though he doubted its validity. He also documented every interaction with Anthony, ensuring a paper trail in case the matter escalated to court. But Anthony wasn't staying idle. One evening, a legal notice arrived at Mike's door. Anthony was officially filing for custody of Daisy, claiming he was ready to step up as a father. He's not just coming for Daisy, Claire said quietly after reading the notice. He's trying to control us. Mike placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He doesn't control us. And he won't win. With their team of allies growing, including Claire's newfound courage to confront her past, Mike prepared for a battle not just to protect Daisy, but to ensure Anthony faced justice for his actions. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as Mike and Claire took their seats beside their lawyer, Samuel Greer. Across the aisle sat Anthony, wearing an air of smug confidence. His lawyer wasted no time painting him as a reformed man who simply wanted a chance to raise his daughter. But Mike had come prepared. Samuel methodically presented evidence of Anthony's criminal past, his pattern of abusive relationships, and testimony from Claire and 2 other women who had come forward. Claire's voice shook as she recounted her experiences, but her bravery captivated the courtroom. He's not here for Daisy, Claire said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. He's here to control. To manipulate. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. The turning point came when the DNA test results were presented. As Mike had suspected, Anthony wasn't Daisy's biological father. His claim crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Samuel seized the moment. Your Honor, this man has no legal or moral claim to Daisy. He has a history of exploiting and harming others. We urge the court to ensure he cannot continue to endanger innocent lives. The judge deliberated briefly before delivering the verdict. Anthony's custody claim was dismissed, and a restraining order was placed to protect both Daisy and Claire. Anthony was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs after new charges were filed against him, thanks to the additional testimonies. The sense of relief was palpable as Mike and Claire stepped outside. For the first time in weeks, Mike felt like the weight on his chest had lifted. I don't know how to thank you, Claire said, tears brimming in her eyes. You already have, Mike replied, his gaze softening. But their moment of peace was interrupted when Cleo emerged from the crowd, her heels clicking against the pavement. Mike, she said, her tone uncharacteristically restrained. I heard about the trial. I thought you might need support. Mike stiffened. Support? After everything you said about Daisy? I made a mistake, Cleo said, her eyes darting toward Claire and Daisy. I was angry, but I've had time to think. I want to make things right. Claire, standing protectively beside Daisy's stroller, exchanged a wary glance with Mike. We don't need you, Cleo, Mike said firmly. Daisy and I are building a life, a real one. And there's no room for manipulation or selfishness in it. Cleo opened her mouth to argue but seemed to realize it was futile. With a huff, she turned and disappeared into the crowd. As they walked back to the car, Claire finally broke the silence. Do you think she'll give up that easily? Mike shook his head. People like Cleo and Anthony don't give up, they just wait for another chance. But we'll be ready. For the first time, Claire smiled. We will. months passed, and the turmoil that had consumed Mike's life began to fade. Daisy, now a thriving infant with a toothy smile and a curious gaze, had become the heart of his world. The once sterile penthouse had been transformed into a warm, welcoming home filled with laughter, toys, and Claire's gentle touch. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike found himself on the balcony, holding Daisy as she gurgled happily. Claire joined them, her presence as natural and comforting as the evening breeze. "She's growing so fast," Claire said, watching Daisy reach for the fading rays of sunlight. "She's incredible," Mike replied, his voice filled with awe. "I didn't know it was possible to feel this much love." Claire smiled, her gaze softening. "You've done so much for her, Mike. For both of us." He turned to her, the weight of everything they'd been through reflected in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Claire. You've been my anchor through all of this." For a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Then, with a deep breath, Mike said, "I've been thinking a lot about the future. About what kind of life I want for Daisy, and for myself." Claire tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "And what do you want?" "I want a life where Daisy is surrounded by love and stability. A life where I can come home to people who make me better," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I can't imagine that life without you." Claire's breath caught as Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know this might seem sudden," he said, his voice tinged with nervousness, "but I've never been more certain of anything. Claire Bennett, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she looked at him, then at Daisy, who giggled as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Yes," Claire said, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was a simple but heartfelt ceremony, held in a garden filled with daisies, Lucy's favorite flower. Surrounded by close friends and a growing sense of family, Mike and Claire promised to build a future together. Years later, on a bright summer day, Mike found himself at the beach, helping Daisy build a sandcastle while Claire watched with their newborn son in her arms. As the waves lapped at the shore, Mike reflected on how far they'd come. His life was no longer about control or perfection, it was about love, resilience, and the family he never knew he needed. And for the first time, he felt truly at peace. Years had passed, but the memories of those tumultuous days remained vivid for Mike. On the anniversary of Lucy's passing, he found himself walking through the small garden he'd cultivated behind their home, a space filled with daisies, a tribute to his sister's gentle spirit. Daisy, now a bright and spirited girl of 7, ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the air as she chased butterflies. Claire stood nearby, holding their toddler son, Luke, who clapped his chubby hands in delight. Mike knelt by a patch of daisies, brushing his fingers gently over the soft petals. "Hey, Luce," he said softly. "I hope you're watching. Daisy's just like you, brave, curious, and full of life. You'd be so proud of her." As he stood, Daisy ran over and grabbed his hand. "Daddy, come play. We're building a fort." "Of course, sweetheart," Mike said, scooping her up as she squealed in delight. He joined Claire and Luke under the shade of a tree, where blankets and pillows had been arranged into a makeshift fortress. As they laughed and played together, Mike felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The life he had now wasn't the one he'd planned, but it was richer and more meaningful than he could have imagined. Later that evening, as the sun set and the sky turned golden, Mike stood on the porch with Claire, their children asleep inside. "She would have loved this," Claire said, leaning into him. "She would have," Mike agreed, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "And I think she'd be happy knowing her Daisy is surrounded by so much love." Claire smiled. "And so much family." Mike kissed her temple and gazed out at the garden, where the daisies swayed gently in the breeze. Life had thrown him into chaos, but through it all, he'd found a way to bloom, just like the flowers his sister had loved so much. In the end, it wasn't about the life he'd lost, but the one he'd built. And it was beautiful.